Hello everybody. In this video, I'm going to argue in favor of a ceasefire in Gaza. I'm going to respond to some of the arguments that I see most frequently from opponents of the ceasefire. If you already agree with me and are only interested in how to help, you can skip down to the call to action at the end of the video. So, for those of you who don't know, on October 7th, Hamas conducted a brutal terrorist attack against Israel that, in addition to attacking military targets, also killed a lot of innocent civilians and took many of them hostage. Of course, I condemn any and all violence against innocent people, regardless of nationality or ethnicity, and I see the deaths of innocents there as a great tragedy. But in response to the attack, the Israeli government has unleashed a reckless bombing campaign and ground invasion against the people in Gaza, killing thousands of innocent children and women, and that's just from the immediate effects of the bombing. People have been displaced from their homes, and now there's mass starvation. So it's getting worse and turning into probably the worst humanitarian crisis in recent memory. It seems to me that in order to be morally consistent, if we are going to condemn the harming of innocents in the October 7th attack, we should also condemn Israel's response. There is just so much to say, and I kind of don't know where to start, so I think I'll begin by addressing some of the ways that I see the discussion being misframed by the opponents of ceasefire. The first way that I see the issue misframed is the idea that this is about whether you take anti-Semitism seriously, and the idea that opposition to the acts of the Israeli state is a politically extreme stance, or even anti-Semitic. And I think the reasoning might be something like this, that in order to support the Zionist project, you need to support the actions that the state of Israel is taking to defend itself, and that to object to the actions of the state of Israel would make you an anti-Zionist, and therefore anti-Semitic, because you are against doing what is necessary to secure the safety of the Jewish people. For context, what is meant by Zionism is the idea or movement that supports the idea that the Jewish people should have a national state that is by and for the Jewish people in the Holy Land. There are different kinds of Zionism, and different people probably have very different ideas about what they might want it to look like. I believe that it is plausible that someone could use Zionism in a more cultural rather than political sense, where they view the project not so much as creating a national state exclusively for Jewish people, but as being about creating a homeland in a broader sense. This would entail immigrating and building a community within a binational state along with the indigenous Palestinians and revitalizing the culture and language. I actually think that the language revitalization is really cool, and coming together as a community and making their homeland in the Middle East in the broader sense is nothing to object to in itself. But the dominant strains of Zionism that have been carried out in actual practice are about creating a nation state by and for the Jewish people. This involves giving special privileges to Jewish people and codifying it into law, like with the nation-state law. It has also involved keeping a majority Jewish population, which has required expelling and taking land from the previous residents, like in the Nakba of 1948. This is what people are usually referring to when they talk about Zionism. And it is the resultant dispossession of the Palestinians, the legal discrimination, and the fact that they don't have the right to self-determination that I and people in my political camp take issue with. With that established, back to the argument. So the problem with this line of reasoning is that both jumps of logic are wrong. Firstly, you could be a Zionist and still be very critical of the actions of the Israeli state, both because of the way Palestinians have been treated, as well as the implications of those actions on the long-term safety and well-being of Israeli citizens. You could disagree with me a lot on the overall Israel-Palestine issue, or even politics in general, but also believe that certain red lines should not be crossed. You don't even have to be on the left like me to support a ceasefire. I think it's an obviously correct position for a conservative, or a right-wing libertarian, or for someone who doesn't even really care about politics. For me, the simplest reason to support a ceasefire is that it is in line with the Christian mandate to love your neighbor. For the record, my stance on the issue is that I think that the only real long-term solution is for there to be one multi-ethnic democratic state with equal rights for all, including Arab and Jewish people. There needs to be the right of return for Palestinians, as well as reparations for Palestinians and investment in their communities and so forth. This comes out of a belief in equal human rights for all, and that we should strive to protect all innocent life, both Israeli and Palestinian. For as far as I'm concerned, if you're born and raised somewhere, you have a right to live there. But, you could disagree with me on that and think that that's wildly unrealistic or whatever. Either way, a ceasefire is clearly the right thing. So, when opponents of ceasefire make their case by directing the discussion to the Israel-Palestine conflict more broadly, it is a complete red herring. It is astounding to me the amount of ideological and empirical ground you can concede to defenders of the actions of the Israeli state and still have a knockdown case against them. In fact, I would say that one of the things that has persuaded me the most of the need to call for a ceasefire has been the arguments of the opponents themselves, which so brazenly disregard Palestinian life and fall apart even on their own terms. The second leap of logic is that being an anti-Zionist makes you an anti-Semite. I think the reason that people think this is because it is certainly possible to be an anti-Zionist for anti-Semitic reasons. Anti-Semitism is evil, and it is a very serious problem, and anti-Semites do exist. And I'm sure there are probably corners of the internet where people are making anti-Zionist arguments from an anti-Semitic perspective. These people are utter cretins who will stub their toe and crap their pants in the morning and then blame it on Jewish people. So I think that this stark reality can put some people into a sort of siege mentality that makes them more inclined to deflect legitimate critique as being merely anti-Semitic. I think this ties in with people's identity really strongly too, and I know what it's like to grow up thinking something and feel the need to play defense for it. I myself grew up in a high-demand religious tradition that I've turned out to be very critical of, and coming to that realization is a very difficult process. There are people on the other side of the issue who I think are great people, and I feel like I understand why they get sucked into it, even though I disagree with them very sharply. So I don't want to make light of the very real problem of anti-Semitism when I say that, with all that being said, the idea that being anti-Zionist requires you to be an anti-Semite is complete nonsense. Firstly, a lot of the most vocal critics of Zionism, like Ilan Pappé, Noam Chomsky, and Norman Finkelstein, are themselves Jewish. And originally, Orthodox Jews were very anti-Zionist because they thought it was heretical to bring about the return to the Holy Land through human agency rather than wait for divine intervention. And many of them are anti-Zionist to this day. And personally, I know a couple Jewish people who are very anti-Zionist and who I'm sure would say far brasher things than I would be comfortable saying. And it's not just like a handful of academic cranks like, okay, here we got our Candace Owens or whatever. There are loads of Jewish people who view themselves as anti-Zionist. You've got whole organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now, which are anti-Zionist. So this isn't just random people grifting for clout or whatever, but rather a lot of people who sincerely feel like Zionism contradicts their values as Jewish people. And additionally, you can be a Zionist and be anti-Semitic. A lot of the early European Zionists were anti-Semites who wanted a reason for Jews to leave their home countries. And I think it's kind of anti-Semitic to suggest that all Jewish people have to think the same way on this issue, and also to thereby erase the diversity of different interpretations of Judaism. Regardless of what you think about that, much of the critique of Zionism centers around the way things have played out for Palestinians, and even people who consider themselves Zionists will often recognize that there have been injustices against the Palestinians, and particularly today, to say the least, there's a very serious humanitarian crisis that has resulted in an enormous amount of suffering for the Palestinian people. So it seems that we can conclude by way of Occam's razor that there are reasons completely disconnected from anti-Semitism to be an anti-Zionist. In response, I often hear people acknowledge this but ask, well, why are you focusing on us so much when these kinds of things happen all the time to people all over the world? It's kind of weird that you seem to take issue with it only when we do it. The first reason to focus on this issue is that the Israeli reprisal has been particularly gruesome, which is why I think even mainstream outlets are covering this with some level of detail. But speaking as someone who is on the socialist left, there is another much more innocuous reason. People on the left are very critical of US empire, and Israel is the US's ally in the Middle East. Because of this, we believe that we can actually do something about this injustice. Our tax dollars go to providing Israel with the weapons that they use to massacre innocent civilians. If we can get our government to simply condition aid or withdraw support to Israel, that alone could end what we consider to be a genocide. We think that the US empire is bad and not interested in helping people around the world, but rather in exploiting them. So we criticize Israel for much the same reason that we criticize the United States for its genocidal sanctions regime against Iraq, which was followed up by a brutal invasion. We are critical of Israel for much the same reason we are critical of Saudi Arabia for its genocide against Yemen. Furthermore, Israel was a settler colonial project. We don't like systems of hierarchy over people because that goes against our egalitarian values. People in my camp are very critical of European colonialism as well as neocolonialism as it exists today. So we don't just focus on Israel, we're pretty consistent in our critique. If you want proof of this, then just go look up anti-imperialist content by left-wing and socialist content creators, and you'll find plenty of material criticizing the actions of the US empire and colonialism. This is why, judging from my own experience at least, when you go to ceasefire protests, you'll see a lot of signs and stuff that are very critical of US empire and Joe Biden, as well as signs from people who are Jewish standing in solidarity with Palestinian people, rather than anti-Semitic stuff. Now, you might not agree with my beliefs about the US empire or how we can stop it or whatever. Fair enough. But those are some of the main reasons that people in my political camp take the positions that we do, and they are in no way grounded in anti-Semitism. Another way which I think this issue is misframed is sometimes people will say that it's about which side you trust more. And I understand that navigating these kinds of events can feel kind of overwhelming because one side is saying one thing and the other side is calling the other side a liar, and it feels like in order to come to a determination on the issue, you would have to settle certain facts which are up for debate, and that's not really something that you're in a position to do just being a random citizen on the other side of the world. But this framing is false too, because even if we build our case entirely on what the Israeli government has admitted to, we still have the winning argument. Even by the Israelis' own numbers, about 2/3 of the people killed in this reprisal are civilians, and IDF spokesmen have admitted on television that they have dropped bombs in refugee camps where they knew tons of innocent people were because, according to them, a Hamas commander was there. They have admitted to accidentally killing their own hostages, which is insane. These Israeli hostages were shirtless, waving white flags, and the IDF killed them because supposedly they thought it was a trap. One of them managed to survive the original round of fire and retreat into the building, and then, instead of stopping and realizing that they goofed up, they finished him off. So even if they are telling the truth that they're trying to conduct their campaign in a way that minimizes civilian casualties, which is very difficult to believe, we can conclude that they are completely incompetent at doing so and should therefore stop immediately. I wouldn't trust these people to pet sit my dog while I'm out of town, much less make life or death decisions about Palestinians. All of that can be acknowledged even if you do trust the Israeli state overall, and I don't think you should. States in general have an incentive to lie and often do not care about their own people, much less their neighbors. One thing that really strains their credibility is the fact that they are escalating attacks in the West Bank, which is not controlled by Hamas. If the whole operation is about combating Hamas, then tell me, why are they escalating violence in the West Bank? And on top of all this, Israeli government officials and politicians have been saying some pretty unhinged stuff. So with these people running the show, is it really that hard to believe that they would be committing atrocities? Some people will argue that you should trust the IDF by saying things like, oh, well, Israel's army is so moral because they do things like warn civilians to leave their homes before they start bombing. And look at them here. They're just letting all of these Palestinians safely evacuate. If they were really so bad, why wouldn't they just shoot them? For starters, just because they could be doing more evil doesn't mean that the things they have done aren't bad. Sure, it's better to get forced out of your home than killed, but getting forced out of your home is also bad in and of itself. But also, there are non-altruistic reasons that they would stay their hand in some cases. Firstly, they need to uphold a veneer of caring about human rights to at least buy them time. I'll talk about this more later, but if they don't, the backlash internationally could cause them to lose much needed support, which has happened before. Israel depends greatly on American support, so much so that when President Reagan, of all people, was disgusted by the effects of Israeli bombing in Lebanon, he was able to get Israel to stop with just a phone call. Secondly, this is an illusion they need to uphold for their domestic population and also their soldiers, many of whom, notwithstanding the immense amount of cultural and social conditioning to harden their hearts towards their enemy, have a limit. It's not good for morale when you have IDF soldiers who burn out and become vocal critics of their government. Given that many on the far right have called for an expansion of Israel's borders, it seems that their goal is to ethnically cleanse Gaza and take it for themselves. If that is your goal, then showing a little restraint to keep plausible deniability is actually the best policy. So, what are the moral arguments that people make to defend this? Really bad ones. The laziest one that I hear is that people will say, war is war. Yeah, and war crimes are war crimes. That is precisely the thing that we're arguing about, whether there are red lines you cannot cross even during war. I don't see why moral truths would suddenly cease to exist because a government has declared war. This thought-terminating cliche is a very weird, circular, and frankly, self-incriminating argument. The idea that there are just and unjust ways to carry out a war has been known since at least the Middle Ages. So opponents of a ceasefire who reject this idea are really taking us back to the Stone Ages on this one. And this applies to people who justify the deaths of Palestinians by claiming that, oh, well, it's different because these are inadvertent deaths, unlike Hamas, who deliberately kills civilians. Firstly, by just looking at the bombing, I find it really hard to believe that the IDF is not targeting civilians. But even so, there are standards by which you have to abide while engaging in war. And if you aren't abiding by those standards, well, you're not abiding by them, regardless of what your intentions are. If I drove 80 miles an hour through a school zone blindfolded, because it was fun or whatever, the damage may be inadvertent, but I would be no less morally accountable. So I see this as really the same kind of thing. And this also applies to attempts to deny Israel's agency in the matter by saying, this is really all Hamas's fault, and the war could end if Hamas would just surrender. Sure, Hamas sucks. They share plenty of blame in the matter. But even if you have a good reason to go to war, the whole concept of war crimes is about what lines you can't cross, even in war. The bottom line is that Israel has the option to not drop bombs on civilians. That's up to them. Defenders of the actions of the Israeli state will also try to deny Israel's agency in the matter by arguing that Hamas is using human shields so that their hand is basically forced. And in order to combat Hamas, collateral damage is inevitable. This argument is wrong for a couple reasons. First, I would push back on the empirical claim. As far as I understand it, there isn't really any evidence that Hamas uses human shields in the technical sense of the term, but rather the argument is made in a looser sense that Hamas is placing its military infrastructure perilously close to civilian infrastructure. But this is something that a lot of countries do, including Israel, so it should not be so surprising that Hamas would be doing this, given that they're operating in pretty tight space. But secondly, even if it were true in the technical sense, you don't shoot human shields. If a mass shooter was shooting up a school and then decided to take several people hostage, it would be unacceptable to just blow up the school in order to neutralize the mass shooter. This should not be a controversial line of reasoning. A more gutsy, but also more self-incriminating moral argument is to say that Hamas and all the Palestinians are all basically Nazis. And when your enemy is that evil, everything is permitted. After all, they say, in World War II, the Allies bombed civilians in Germany and the US dropped nukes on Japan. And that was okay, right? Opponents of ceasefire could say this, meaning that Hamas is such an existential threat that these unsavory means are sadly necessary. Or they could point to the fact that Palestinians are in favor of the October 7th attacks and say this meaning that Palestinians deserve to be bombed to high heavens. And it is the case that a lot of Palestinians are in favor of the attacks. Polling that I've seen clocks in with an average around 75%, although those in the West Bank are more supportive than Gazans. As for the first version of this argument, no, mass bombing of civilian centers is not necessary. We'll get more into this later, but this is, if nothing else, a woefully impractical way of trying to resolve the issue. For now, it suffices to point out that Hamas, as bad as they may be, are nowhere near as powerful as Nazi Germany was in World War II. They just don't pose the same kind of existential threat. That's not to say that Israel doesn't have legitimate security concerns, but Israel has the guns, they have the tanks, they have the well-trained soldiers. This is just not the same kind of conflict. Israel has the upper hand and more control over what happens in this situation. It's also worth adding that it's not really clear that bombing civilian centers in World War II really helped the Allies win. Now, the other version of the argument, which is to say that Palestinians deserve to be bombed because they are all bloodthirsty demons or bear collective guilt, is much bolder, but equally delusional and frankly, completely psychotic. So there are a few things that are wrong with that line of reasoning. And I have to point out again that we are not debating about whether large numbers of civilians are getting killed. Defenders of the actions of the Israeli state who make this argument are acknowledging it. And we're just arguing about whether it's okay. First off, nearly half of the population of Gaza is younger than 18. You can't hold children accountable for October 7th. These are people who weren't old enough to vote for Hamas. Even if you don't want to count the older teenagers as children, still, a lot of the people being killed in Gaza are young children. They are innocent. Furthermore, there's still a minority of people who did not support the attacks, and they're being killed too. So even if the proportions are smaller, a lot of innocent people are still being killed. Now, this is a really controversial take here, but just because people have done something in the past doesn't mean that it was right. Dropping the nukes on Japan, I think, was morally wrong, as was bombing civilian targets on the Western Front. Now, you could maybe debate capital punishment for extremely heinous crimes, but otherwise, killing people should only be done when necessary for self-defense. I don't think you have license to kill somebody because they have been deluded by an idiotic and evil ideology. And that goes double for people who did not support the evil and idiotic ideology of their country. And it certainly applies to children who cannot be held accountable for their parents, communities, or government's crimes. If you take human rights seriously, then that's enough of a counter-argument for you. Secondly, it is important to remember that the poll shows support for the attack as the Palestinians understood it. While supporting the October 7th attack is certainly a bad take, it doesn't mean that they support the atrocities committed against Israeli civilians, much less that they would commit atrocities themselves if given the chance. As the polling data shows, the overwhelming majority were unaware of the full scope of the violence on October 7th, and were in denial when told otherwise. So, while they support armed resistance, they are not bloodthirsty war crime-loving monsters. To be sure, the poll speaks to the divide between these peoples and the very real challenge standing in the way of the sort of reconciliation between the two peoples that I would like to see under a shared democratic state. But tons of people have been foolish enough to support war, and that doesn't make them irredeemable, war crime-loving monsters who have lost the right to life. We can see that by just flipping this reasoning back on the other side. This anti-ceasefire argument could be used to justify acts of violence against many nations, including Israel. In the United States, at the start of the Iraq War, something like 72% of the population supported it. The Iraq War killed a lot more innocent people than the October 7th attacks. And it was a completely unjustified act of aggression. So, should all of those American citizens, some 72%, be killed? Do they not have the right to life? Or do we show some compassion and understand that they were caught up in war fervor and misled by evil politicians and a complicit media? As it relates to Israel, do you think that nobody in Israel holds dehumanizing beliefs about Palestinians or supports violence against them? Just go look up videos of people chanting "death to Arabs." I don't think that they represent the majority of Israelis, but these people exist. Some 60% of Jewish Israelis support segregation. Many Israelis support annexing parts of the West Bank. That's Palestinian land. And most Israeli Jews don't support giving Palestinians the right to vote within it. Or how about this one? 95% of Jewish Israeli citizens supported Operation Protective Edge, where Israel discarded ongoing ceasefire negotiations for a brutal military operation killing and wounding thousands. The logic that defenders of the actions of the Israeli state are using, if used consistently, could be used to justify wanton violence against Israelis. You might protest that, Israelis may have felt that they had a justification for Operation Protective Edge because of previous rocket attacks from Gaza. But using that same logic, the Palestinians can say that they are justified in retaliation due to the fact that Israel has upheld a 17-year-long blockade in violation of international law. Or, let's just talk about the whole colonial project and the Nakba and the fact that many Israelis, including the Likud party, which is the Prime Minister's party, do not support the existence of a Palestinian state at all. It is here that I must point out that I find this anti-ceasefire argument both disgusting and profoundly revelatory. It shows the extent to which dehumanization is at the center of the anti-ceasefire position. Not just because the argument seeks to dehumanize victims of ethnic cleansing, but also it relies on a certain level of dehumanization in order to make sense. It indulges the Israeli desire for revenge, while foreclosing the possibility that the Palestinians could have any reason at all to resent their colonizers. The anti-ceasefire arguments start falling apart the moment you understand that the Palestinians are also human. To be sure, that does not justify wanton acts of violence by them against Israelis. But likewise, you can't use October 7th as a justification to commit war crimes against Palestinians. Because that's how cycles of violence work. There's always a previous aggression that you can use as a justification. The question is whether we want to end these cycles of violence or perpetuate them. If we want to end them, we must start with not demonizing other people, but understanding that they are human and have reasons for feeling the way they do, even if we think that they are horribly misguided and wrong. Now, this isn't just about moral grandstanding. When we get an understanding of the Palestinian perspective, not only can we more easily combat attempts to dehumanize them, we also get a better understanding of how the conflict could be resolved. And this brings us to the last main way that the issue has been misframed. The last way that I think this issue is misframed is that it is presented as a question of either being pragmatic and realistic or idealistic. And the reason that I think a lot of people might think this is the case is that a lot of the arguments that are made against a ceasefire will acknowledge that things are pretty ugly on the ground, but that this is just what war is like, and that Israel is fighting a just war, and that these unsavory actions are what needs to be done in order to defend Israelis. After all, they point out, you just can't have peace with Hamas around, so getting rid of Hamas is the first priority. And then, in response, most people will object on the grounds of defending universal human rights, much like I've done so far. They'll say, no matter what, you just can't kill innocent civilians, and there are certain red lines you can't cross, etc., etc. But I have a little bit of a spicy take here, one of Nerdy Tree's little mind blowers. something can be both immoral and horrendously impractical. Even if we set all of the moral considerations aside, the actions of the Israeli state are wildly impractical from the perspective of securing the safety and security of the Israeli people, and here's why. The first reason is, as mentioned earlier, this sort of ham-fisted approach is hurting their own civilians. The only thing that has actually worked to return a substantial amount of the Israeli hostages home safely has been hostage negotiations with a pause in the fighting. This is what people in my political camp said should have been done, and Netanyahu was dragging his feet and slow to do so, despite the fact that Hamas, much earlier, had said that they would be willing to do a hostage swap. Before that point, I'm sure a lot of people would have called me unrealistic for advocating for a hostage swap and said things like, no, you can't negotiate with terrorists. But it turns out that that's basically the only thing that's really worked. And don't take my word for it, just ask the hostages and their families themselves what they think. Many of them are very angry at Netanyahu and his approach because it jeopardizes the safety of the hostages. Another thing to keep in mind is that even if you view retaliation as necessary, there are far more effective options on the table. Targeted counterterrorism and negotiating to get the foreign countries where Hamas officials are hiding to hand them over will be a far more rational strategy if sticking it to Hamas was the goal. Another reason why it is in Israel's self-interest to stop this offensive is that it erodes support for Israel internationally and makes it even harder to work with their neighbors for sustainable solutions. Many of Israel's neighbors like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt actually have interests in Gaza that they could advance by helping to rebuild the region. Lastly, and I think most importantly, the Israeli offensive is detrimental to getting rid of Hamas because it causes something known as blowback. When you commit wanton acts of violence against a civilian population, they tend not to like that. I know, shocker. They will come to see the aggressor, in this case Israel, as the enemy and the root of the problem, and understandably so, given that they just saw their friends or families blown up by Israeli bombs. And when you add political marginalization and poverty into the mix, you create fertile soil for the ideas of terrorists and religious extremists, who can use their desperation to recruit more people into their ranks. This is something that has been observed by national security experts, and this is part of the reason why America's war on terror was so ineffective. So far, I've been proven right on this one because polling shows that Israel's actions have actually increased support for Hamas, like I thought they would. Although, even now, most Palestinians in the Gaza Strip do not support them. Instead, if you want to get rid of Hamas, you need to give the Palestinians a real political alternative. They, like anyone else, would prefer peaceful solutions to their problems. And for those of you who are skeptical about this route, just remember that, 1, they didn't even really like Hamas that much. While Hamas won a lot of seats in the 2006 election, Hamas only won 45% of the popular vote, and many of those who voted for Hamas did so as a protest vote against a corrupt government rather than because they supported the extreme ideology. Hamas's approval ratings before the October 7th attack were actually really not so high either. So it's very reasonable to believe that given stable conditions and the chance for new elections, that they would opt for a more moderate faction. But if you keep bombing them, support for Hamas may continue to rise. Secondly, Palestinians have tried peaceful means before and it hasn't worked. The Great March of Return resulted in innocent people getting shot at and killed, so maybe allowing peaceful resistance will channel their energies more productively. Lastly, disgruntled and militant native populations have been successfully appeased like this before. Look at Ireland with the IRA or apartheid South Africa. Some people argued that if the whites in South Africa gave up their apartheid state, that the black population would just oppress them in return. But that turned out to not be the case. So what can you do about it? Call your senator and congressional representatives and urge them to support a ceasefire resolution like the one Cori Bush has introduced in the House, and to oppose sending Israel any more weapons. It takes less than 5 minutes to do so. Just find the number for your representative's office here, call, and read off of the script to make it easier. If you don't want to talk to a person, you can call outside of office hours and leave a message. You can also email your representatives. This is a very easy thing to do, and I'll explain why this has a proven historical track record of working. Noam Chomsky, in his book, Hegemony or Survival, talks about how the United States has supplied weapons and support for a lot of very nasty regimes who have committed a laundry list of awful deeds. And those nasty regimes have depended on the support of the United States. And when the United States withdrew support for those regimes, the atrocities those regimes committed stopped because those regimes depended on the US. What caused the US to stop supporting those regimes? It was domestic backlash. When people found out about it back home, they got enraged and said, I don't want my tax dollars to go to this. These were people who could vote, and as craven and corrupt as these politicians are, they still do want to win elections. I don't consider the US to be a democracy overall, but it is democratic enough that this kind of backlash can make a difference. One very clear example of this is East Timor, which Chomsky tells about in the book's second chapter. In East Timor, the US and Britain militarily and diplomatically supported Indonesia's brutal occupation that lasted around 25 years and killed about 200,000 people. Things got worse in 1999 after the brave folks in East Timor voted in favor of independence in a referendum. However, this time, the atrocities got public attention here in the US. At first, then President Clinton responded to the crisis by saying, hey, that's none of our business, let's just let Indonesia handle this. But the American public wasn't having it. After sharp backlash and critique from activists and people like you and me, domestically and internationally, President Clinton reversed the long-standing policy of support for Indonesia. As a result, Indonesia withdrew from East Timor, and an Australian-led UN peacekeeping force was able to step in. Another example that Noam Chomsky talks about is Central America, where the Reagan administration wanted at first to resort to Vietnam-style bombing and atrocities on our political enemies. But after public backlash, they had to pull back and instead resort to far more covert means. That's not to say that all the harm stopped, because those covert means still caused a lot of suffering. And it's also not to say that you and the 10 other people who are going to watch this video will bring about world peace by just calling your senator. But as Chomsky notes, targeted public backlash from normal people like you and me serves as a real restraint on otherwise unchecked US power, and it definitely can soften the blow and reduce human suffering. It has a proven track record of working, and if you're a pragmatist like me, then you'll think that we should stick with what's worked so far and do it more. As it pertains to the ethnic cleansing in Palestine, Israel depends on US support greatly, and if the US conditions aid to Israel, they will listen up. And so far, getting people to call their representatives has actually worked. At first, when Cori Bush put her ceasefire proposal forward, it was just like her and 12 other representatives in the House. But now she is joined by 58 other representatives in the House and 4 senators. And some number of these new allies have joined because of targeted calling campaigns. I know this because I was part of one of these campaigns. I was doing phone banking to get people to call their representatives and urge them to support Cori Bush's ceasefire resolution. I remember specifically getting people to call Earl Blumenauer, and he has now supported the proposal, and I was led to understand that Barbara Lee hopped on board in response to one of our phone banking sessions as well. So this stuff can definitely work. Other things that you can do are go to any pro-Palestine protests in your area and show support. As a side note, this is why it's good to be in touch with your local left and be part of like the DSA or something, because you'll be made aware of this stuff when it's happening and have people to go with. Also, in general, when you can, talk to other people about this, post on social media, and be vocal. People should know where you stand on the issue. I understand a lot of you might feel uncomfortable about posting about super controversial issues, especially on an issue like this where it's easy to be misinterpreted. But just keep it simple and focused on the welfare of the innocent people in Gaza, as well as on a clear call to action, like the one I have here, where I'm telling people to call their congressional representatives. Make it very clear that your concerns are purely humanitarian and that you want safety for everyone, both Israeli and Palestinian, and people can't really get too angry at that. Also, if you have the means, you can donate to worthy causes like the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which are doing good work to alleviate some of the suffering. It's also good to get more informed on the issue so you can push back on nonsense talking points. You can start by watching YouTube videos, but you should really graduate to reading books. On imperialism more broadly, I like a lot of Chomsky's and Michael Parenti's work. I'll link to some good channels who have made their own book recommendations on the Palestinian struggle more specifically. And with that, I finished my rant. Thank you to everyone who has made it this far. If you haven't yet, smash like and leave a little comment to boost this in the algorithm and give me a little surge of dopamine to brighten my day. Until next time, this has been a Nerdy Tree production.